The morning sky on Nexus 7 glowed orange as two suns rose over the horizon. Lieutenant Abigail Crawford stepped out of her small research shelter and took a deep breath of the alien air. It smelled like cinnamon and wet soil. After 3 weeks on this planet, she was still getting used to it. Abigail was the soil expert for the human-alien joint mission. While 20 other humans worked with the tall, blue-skinned Viridians at the main camp 5 miles away, she preferred the quiet of her remote outpost. Here, she could focus on her soil samples without interruption. "Crawford to base, morning check-in," she said into her wrist communicator. "All systems normal at Outpost East, beginning today's collection series." "Base to Crawford received," replied the voice of Frank Powell, the communications officer. "Commander Daniels wants your weekly report by sunset. The Viridians are getting impatient about your findings." Abigail sighed. "Tell him it's almost ready. Soil science takes time, even on Earth. These alien compounds are twice as complex." After finishing her breakfast, Abigail grabbed her collection kit and walked to the testing area. She knelt down and pressed her hand against the dark purple soil. Something felt different today. There was a slight vibration, almost too faint to notice. She took out her sensor probe and pushed it into the ground. The readings on her tablet showed unusual movement patterns 8 feet below the surface. Abigail frowned. This was new. "Base, this is Crawford. I'm picking up some strange vibrations in the eastern sector. Can you ask the Viridian scientists if this is normal for the season?" After a few minutes, Powell's voice returned. "They say it's just the soil settling after the recent rains. Nothing to worry about." Abigail wasn't convinced. She had studied soils on 17 different planets over her 20-year career. These vibrations were not natural settling. They were rhythmic, almost like heartbeats. "I'd like to speak directly with Chief Scientist Zax," she insisted. "He's in a meeting with Commander Daniels," Powell replied. "But he left a message saying they've seen this before. The vibrations will stop in a day or two." Abigail spent the next few hours collecting samples and running tests in her small lab. The results were puzzling. The soil's chemical balance was changing rapidly, becoming more acidic. Something was releasing compounds into the ground. Just after midday, her communicator beeped. It was Susan Rivera, one of the biologists at the Northern Observation Post. "Abigail, have you seen any unusual insects around your station?" Susan asked, her voice tense. "Insects? No, why?" "We've spotted some strange bug-like creatures emerging from the ground near our position. They're like nothing in the Viridian biological database. I've sent some images to your tablet." Abigail looked at the pictures. The creatures had 8 legs, transparent shells, and sharp cutting mouthparts. They were about the size of her thumb. "How many have you seen?" Abigail asked. "At first just a few, but now there are hundreds coming out of a hole about 50 yards from our station." The Viridians seemed nervous. Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. The vibrations, the changing soil chemistry, it all made sense now. "Susan, I think you should alert base camp immediately. These might be related to the soil disturbances I've been detecting." 2 hours later, the situation had escalated dramatically. Abigail watched her screen in horror as emergency alerts flooded the communication system. The insects were now emerging all across the northern sector, and they were aggressive. "All personnel, this is Commander Scott Daniels. We are declaring a Level 1 emergency. The insects are attacking the camp perimeter. They're cutting through our barriers with their mandibles. Security teams are deploying repellent measures, but they seem ineffective. All outpost personnel, stay in place until we assess if these creatures are widespread." Abigail quickly ran. New tests on her soil samples? The vibrations were stronger now and spreading in her direction. Whatever was happening underground was getting closer to her position. She called the main base again, but the connection was breaking up. She could hear shouting and strange clicking sounds in the background. "Base, this is Crawford. What's happening?" "Do you need me to return to camp?" Powell's voice came through, filled with panic. "Crawford, stay where you are. They're everywhere, hundreds of thousands of them. They're cutting through everything, equipment, structures, even people. The Viridians are being targeted most heavily. Their exoskeletons seem to attract the swarm. In the background, Abigail could hear screams and the sound of metal being torn apart. The rescue shuttle is being prepared, Powell continued. Commander Daniels is ordering full evacuation. The Viridian camp commander has been killed. These things, we're calling them razor beetles. They move like they're being controlled by something. They're cutting off escape routes, disabling vehicles. The communication suddenly improved, and Abigail could see Powell's face on her screen. He was pale, with sweat running down his forehead. Behind him, people were running and alarms were blaring. "Listen carefully," he said. "They're coming through the ventilation systems now. We've noticed they're attracted to movement and body heat. If anyone survives, remember that. The remaining rescue shuttle is departing in..." The screen went black. Abigail tried several times to re-establish contact, but there was nothing. She switched to the emergency channel and heard only fragments of messages, none of them hopeful. "Double quotes ... overrun position 4... ... can single quote stop them ... shuttle damaged during takeoff ... double quote ... no survivors in sector 6 ... Abigail ran outside and climbed onto the roof of her shelter with her binoculars. In the distance she could see smoke rising from the main camp. Through the powerful lenses she spotted movement along the ground, a vast, shifting mass flowing like a river from the north. Heading directly toward the camp, the swarm had arrived. She watched in stunned silence as the razor beetles engulfed the camp. Even from 5 miles away, she could see structures collapsing as the insects undermined foundations and cut through support beams. The few vehicles attempting to escape were quickly surrounded and immobilized. Abigail's hands trembled as she lowered the binoculars. The reality of her situation hit her all at once. The camp was gone. The evacuation had failed. And based on the movement pattern of the swarm, they would reach her outpost by nightfall. She was completely alone on an alien planet with a deadly insect army heading straight for her. Abigail climbed down from the roof, her mind racing. She had only hours before the swarm reached her outpost. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but her military training kicked in. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. First, she secured her shelter, sealing every crack and opening with emergency repair foam. Then she gathered all her research data and equipment in one place. If she survived, this information might be valuable. If she didn't, maybe someone would find it someday. Abigail reviewed what she knew about the razor beetles. Powell had said they were attracted to movement and body heat. That meant hiding would be difficult. The beetles had cut through metal barriers at the main camp, so her small shelter wouldn't hold for long. She needed to think differently. These were biological creatures, so they must have biological weaknesses. Abigail turned to her soil samples. If the beetles lived underground, there might be something in the soil that affected them. She started testing various soil compositions. From around her outpost, after an hour of frantic work, she found something promising. Soil samples from near the natural mud pools about half a mile from her position showed high levels of sulfuric compounds. In her tests, the organic material in these samples broke down much slower than others. Could the sulfur be toxic to the beetles? She wondered aloud. Abigail grabbed her field kit and ran to the nearest mud pool. The mud here was thick and dark gray, with a strong smell like rotten eggs. She collected several samples and hurried back to her shelter. Under her microscope, she saw tiny crystals in the mud that contained concentrated sulfur compounds. When she tested a small piece of insect chitin from her biological reference samples, the crystals caused it to deteriorate. Through her window, Abigail could see the sun beginning to set. Soon it would be dark, and the swarm would arrive. She didn't have time for more tests. She ran to her equipment storage and pulled out the small excavation unit she used for deep soil samples. It wasn't designed for large-scale digging, but it was all she had. She also grabbed every container she could find. Working frantically, Abigail began digging a trench around her shelter, about 15 feet out in all directions. The excavator whined as she pushed it beyond its intended use, but the soft ground made the work possible. As darkness fell, she switched on her portable lights and kept digging. The trench was only 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, not enough to stop the beetles, but that wasn't her plan. Once the trench circled her entire shelter, she started making trips to the mud pools with all her containers. Load after load, she filled the trench with the sulfur-rich mud. Her muscles burned with exhaustion, but fear kept her moving. On her 6th trip to the mud pools, she heard it, the faint clicking sound that Susan had described, coming from the direction of the main camp. The swarm was getting closer. Abigail worked faster, pouring the last containers of mud into the trench. The moat was complete, but would it work? She had no time to find out. She grabbed one final load of mud and retreated to her shelter. Sealing the door behind her dot from her window, she watched as the first wave of razor beetles appeared at the edge of her cleared area. In the beam of her spotlight, their transparent bodies gleamed like moving glass. There were thousands of them, moving together like a single organism. The beetles approached the mud moat and stopped. They seemed to be testing the air with their front legs. Abigail held her breath. After a moment, the swarm began to move again, but not across the moat. Instead, they split into 2 groups, circling around her position. "They're looking for a way in," she whispered. The beetles completely surrounded her shelter, but remained on the other side of the mud moat. Some approached the edge and touched the mud with their legs, only to quickly pull back. The sulfur compound was working. They wouldn't cross it. For now, she was safe. Abigail spent the night watching the swarm. The beetles tried different approaches. Some attempted to jump across narrow sections of the moat, while others piled on top of each other, trying to build living bridges. But each time they touched the mud, they retreated. By morning, Abigail was exhausted but alive. The swarm remained, constantly testing her defenses. She knew the mud would eventually dry out or wash away if it rained. She needed to improve her moat. Using her soil science knowledge, she began mixing different compounds with the mud to make it more resistant to drying. She added natural adhesives from plant material and minerals that would help maintain the sulfur content. On the 2nd day, a light rain began to fall. Abigail watched anxiously as water collected on top of her mud moat. If it washed away, the beetles would cross. But her mixture held. The rain actually helped spread the sulfur smell, keeping the beetles even further back. By the 3rd day, Abigail had established a routine. She carefully reinforced weak sections of the moat, always keeping an eye on the swarm's movements. She set up a small weather station to give her advance warning of rain or wind that might damage her defenses. She also began studying the razor beetles more carefully. Through her binoculars, she observed their behavior and recorded everything she saw. The more she learned, the better she could defend against them. The beetles had a clear hierarchy. Larger ones with darker shells seemed to direct the others. They communicated through those clicking sounds she had heard. During the hottest part of the day, they became less active, seeking shade under the nearby trees. Most importantly, she noticed they had a regular feeding cycle. Every 3 days, the swarm would suddenly withdraw about 100 yards from her position. There, they would dig into the ground and stay dormant for about 6 hours. She guessed they were feeding on something underground or, perhaps, absorbing nutrients from the soil. These rest periods gave Abigail precious time to strengthen her defenses and gather more mud without risking attack. On the 7th day, Abigail spotted something that made her heart sink. A group of beetles had found a small depression where rainwater had washed away some of the mud. They were probing the weakness, and more beetles were gathering. Abigail knew she had to act fast. She grabbed a container of her strongest mud mixture and a long pole she had made from equipment parts. From inside her shelter, she extended the pole over the weak spot and dumped the fresh mud onto it. Several beetles were caught in the mud and died instantly, their bodies dissolving in the sulfuric compound. The others retreated, but Abigail knew they would be back. Her moat was working, but this was just the beginning of a long siege. As night fell on the 7th day, Abigail sat by her window, watching the clicking mass of insects surrounding her small safe zone. How long could she survive like this? How long until her food ran out or her moat failed? She had to find a way to communicate with Earth or with any ships that might be searching for survivors. Tomorrow, she would start building a transmitter from her equipment parts. Someone had to know what happened here, and she was the only one left to tell the story. Day 15 inside the mud moat. Abigail sat cross-legged on the floor of her shelter, surrounded by dismantled equipment. She had been working on her transmitter for over a week now, using parts from her soil analyzers, communication equipment, and even her personal devices. The transmitter was taking shape, but she wasn't sure if it would be powerful enough to reach orbit. Earth was too far away to contact directly, but there might be ships searching for survivors. If she could just get a signal strong enough to reach them, she might have a chance. Abigail looked at her dwindling food supplies. She had started with a month's worth of rations, but she would need to make them last longer. She had already cut her portions in half. Outside, the razor beetles continued their siege. They had settled into a pattern now, constantly circling her mud moat but never crossing it. During their regular dormant periods, Abigail would quickly gather more mud and make repairs to her defenses. She had expanded her moat, making it wider in some places and adding a second ring in others. The work was exhausting, but it kept her mind focused and gave her purpose. Today, Abigail had a new idea. If she could grow some food, she might be able to survive longer. She was a soil scientist, after all. She had seeds in her research supplies, fast-growing plants meant for soil testing. I need to create a growing space, she said to herself. During the next beetle dormant period, Abigail carefully ventured outside with containers and tools. She collected soil from several locations and brought it back inside. She mixed it with nutrients from her lab supplies and planted the seeds in shallow trays. She placed the trays near her window where they would get sunlight. It wasn't much, but if the plants grew, they would supplement her food and give her fresh oxygen. As Abigail worked on her plants, she noticed something strange through the window. A group of larger beetles with darker shells were gathered at one section of the moat. They seemed to be dropping small objects into the mud. Curious, Abigail grabbed her binoculars for a closer look. The beetles were dropping pieces of metal and rock into the mud. They were testing to see if they could create a path across. "They're problem-solving," Abigail whispered, both impressed and terrified. These weren't mindless insects. They were intelligent, and they were adapting to her defenses. Abigail quickly mixed a stronger batch of the sulfur compound and used her pole extender to apply it to that section of the moat. The beetles retreated when the new mud was added, but she knew they would try again. That night, a heavy storm hit. Rain pounded against the shelter's roof, and wind howled around the walls. Abigail stayed awake, watching her moat anxiously. The rain was washing away the outer edges, making it narrower. The beetles were agitated by the storm, moving faster and clicking more loudly. They seemed to sense an opportunity. When lightning flashed, Abigail saw something that made her blood run. Cold, the beetles were gathering dead plant matter and dropping it into the mud. The material was creating a partial bridge across one section of the moat. Without thinking, Abigail grabbed her rain gear and a container of her strongest mud mixture. She had to stop them now before they completed the bridge. She opened her door just enough to squeeze through and stepped out into the storm. The rain was cold and heavy, soaking her immediately. Keeping low, she moved to the threatened section of the moat. The beetles detected her movement and surged toward her. Abigail worked quickly, pouring the fresh mud onto their makeshift bridge. The plant matter sizzled as it made contact with the sulfur compounds. A beetle jumped at her, its mandibles snapping. Abigail fell backward, narrowly avoiding its sharp edges. More beetles were coming. She scrambled to her feet and ran back to the shelter. Slamming the door just as the first beetles reached it, Abigail leaned against the door, breathing hard. That had been too close. She needed a better way to maintain her defenses without putting herself at risk. Over the next few days, Abigail built a simple delivery system using pipes and containers. She could now apply fresh mud to weak points from inside her shelter. She also created a rain collection system that directed water away from her moat. Her small plants were growing well, providing a bit of fresh food. She carefully rationed everything, knowing she might need to survive for months. On day 23, Abigail finished her transmitter. She had salvaged enough parts to create a device that could send a simple distress signal with basic information. About her situation, the power was the biggest challenge. She had to disconnect most of her shelter systems to provide enough energy for the transmitter. That meant no heating at night and minimal lighting. Abigail waited until the Beatles' next dormant period to activate the transmitter. She wanted the signal to be as clear as possible without interference from their clicking communications. When the swarm retreated for their feeding cycle, she climbed onto the roof with the transmitter. The open sky gave her the best chance of the signal reaching orbit. She activated the device and spoke clearly into the microphone. "This is Lieutenant Abigail Crawford, Earth Science Division, stationed at Outpost East on Nexus 7, main camp destroyed by indigenous insect species. Unknown number of casualties. I am alive but trapped. Insects repelled by sulfur compounds in natural mud. Requesting immediate extraction. Will broadcast this message every 3 days during insect dormant period." The transmitter sent her message into space using the last of its power. Abigail had no way of knowing if anyone had received it. She would need to recharge the device using her solar collectors before she could send another message. As she climbed down from the roof, she saw the beetles beginning to stir in the distance. Their dormant period was ending. They would be back soon, testing her defenses again. That night, Abigail made notes about everything she had learned. If rescue never came, at least she could document her discoveries. She drew detailed sketches of the beetles, recorded their behavior patterns, and wrote down the formula for her mud mixture. She also started a personal journal. Day 23, she wrote. Still alive. The mud moat continues to hold. My greatest fear isn't the beetles anymore. It's that everyone thinks I'm dead, and no one is looking for me. But I won't give up. Humans have survived in harsh environments throughout history. This is just another challenge to overcome. As she finished writing, Abigail noticed a new behavior in the swarm. The beetles were gathering in larger groups at specific points around the moat. They seemed to be working together more coordinated than before. They were planning something. The siege was entering a new phase, and Abigail would need all her ingenuity to survive what came next. Day 35. The beetles had developed a new strategy. They were no longer trying to build bridges across the mud moat. Instead, they were digging. Abigail discovered their plan during her morning check of the perimeter. Through her binoculars, she spotted several larger beetles using their front legs to dig into the ground near the outer edge of her moat. They were trying to tunnel underneath it. This was a serious threat. Her moat was only 3 feet deep in most places. If the beetles got beneath it, her entire defense system would be useless. Abigail needed to understand how deep they could dig. She set up a small camera on an extended pole and carefully placed it near one of the digging sites during the beetles' next dormant period. When she reviewed the footage, she saw the beetles had already dug almost 2 feet down. I need to make the moat deeper, she said to herself, but I don't have enough energy to dig the whole perimeter. After thinking for several hours, Abigail came up with a plan. She didn't need to deepen the entire moat. She just needed to create an underground barrier at key points where the beetles were digging. Using her soil excavator, she dug several deep holes inside her safe zone. Near the inner edge of the moat, she dug down 6 feet, then tunneled outward toward the outer edge of the moat. Into these tunnels, she poured her strongest mud mixture, creating underground mud walls. The work was exhausting, and her food supplies were getting dangerously low. The small plants she had grown helped, but they weren't enough. Abigail had lost weight, and she felt weak most of the time, but she kept going. Her underground barriers were working. When the beetles' tunnels hit the mud walls, they stopped digging in those areas and moved to try elsewhere. Each time they started a new tunnel, Abigail added another underground barrier. On day 38, something unexpected happened. During a beetle dormant period, Abigail was on her roof preparing to send another distress signal when she noticed movement at the edge of the nearby forest. It wasn't beetles. A small animal, similar to a rabbit but with 6 legs and green fur, hopped out from between the trees. It moved cautiously, stopping often to sniff the air. The beetles had been so dominant that Abigail had seen very few other creatures since the attack began. The animal approached the outer edge of the beetle territory. Instantly, 3 beetles broke from their dormant state and rushed toward it. The green rabbit-like creature tried to run, but the beetles were too fast. They caught it and began to cut it apart with their mandibles. Abigail watched in horror. But then she realized something important. The beetles guarding the perimeter had come out of their dormant state early to attack the animal. But the majority of the swarm remained dormant. "They have sentries," she whispered, "and the sentries respond to movement." This gave her an idea. If she could distract the sentries during a dormant period, she might have more time to work outside her shelter or send stronger distress signals. Abigail spent the next 2 days building small remote-controlled devices from her remaining equipment. They weren't much, just simple machines that could move and make noise, but they might be enough to distract the beetles. On day 41, she tested her theory. During the next dormant period, she activated one of her devices on the far side of her perimeter. The small machine rolled out about 20 yards beyond her moat and began to move in circles, making a soft humming sound. Just as she had hoped, the beetle sentries detected the movement and sound. 6 of them broke from their dormant state and rushed toward the device. While they were distracted, Abigail quickly moved to the opposite side of her shelter and extended her transmitter antenna much higher than before. Her distraction worked for about 10 minutes before the beetles destroyed the device. But those 10 minutes were enough. Abigail sent a stronger, more detailed distress signal that had a much better chance of reaching any ships in orbit. Encouraged by her success, Abigail built more distraction devices. She could now create regular windows of opportunity during the beetles' dormant periods, allowing her to maintain her defenses more effectively and continue sending signals. On day 44, Abigail was awakened before dawn by a strange sound. At first she thought it was the beetles, but this was different, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to be coming from above. She rushed to her window and looked up at the dark sky. There, moving slowly across the stars, was a light that was too steady to be natural. A ship. Abigail ran to her transmitter, not caring that the beetles weren't in their dormant period. She had to send a signal now, while the ship was close enough to receive it. "This is Lieutenant Abigail Crawford on Nexus 7. I am alive and located at Outpost East. The camp has been destroyed by indigenous insect predators. I am surrounded but protected by a mud barrier containing sulfur compounds that repel the insects. Please respond." She repeated her message 3 times, then waited, her heart pounding. The light in the sky had stopped moving and now seemed to be hovering. Then her transmitter crackled, and a voice came through, faint but clear. "Lieutenant Crawford, this is Captain Olivia Nelson of the Earth Rescue Vessel Northern Light. We have received your transmission and are tracking your location. Stand by for further instructions." Abigail's legs gave way, and she sat down hard on the floor. Tears streamed down her face. Someone had heard her. Help was coming, but her relief was short-lived. Outside, the beetles were reacting to her transmission. The clicking sounds had grown louder, and the swarm was moving in new patterns. They seemed agitated by the electronic signals, or perhaps by the ship's presence. The transmitter crackled again. "Lieutenant, our scans are picking up massive insect activity around your position. We can't land until we understand what we're dealing with. Can you send us data on these creatures and how you've survived?" Abigail wiped her tears and pulled herself together. "Yes, Captain. I've been studying them for over 40 days. They're highly intelligent insect predators with cutting mandibles that can slice through metal. They operate as a coordinated swarm and are attracted to movement and heat, but they're repelled by sulfur compounds found in the natural mud pools on this planet. I've surrounded my shelter with a mud moat that they won't cross." "Understood. We're analyzing your information now. Stand by. The beetles were gathering in larger numbers around her moat. They seemed to sense that something had changed. The largest beetles with the darkest shells were clicking rapidly, and the others were responding. They were preparing for something. "Captain," Abigail said urgently into the transmitter. "Whatever you're planning, please hurry. The beetles are organizing, and I think they're preparing for a major attack. My defenses might not hold much longer. We're working on an extraction plan, Lieutenant. Hold your position. Help is coming." Abigail looked out at the growing swarm. The mud moat had protected her for 44 days, but would it hold long enough for rescue to arrive? The beetles were massing in greater numbers than she had ever seen before, and they were all focused on her. Shelter, the final siege was about to begin. The beetles attacked at dawn on day 45. They came from all directions at once, in perfect coordination. This was not a test of her defenses like before. This was an all-out assault. Abigail watched from her window as thousands of beetles rushed toward her mud moat. Instead of stopping at the edge, they kept coming. The first wave fell into the mud and died, their bodies sizzling as the sulfur compounds broke down their shells. But the next wave climbed over them, using the dead beetles as stepping stones. "They're sacrificing themselves?" Abigail whispered in horror. She grabbed her last containers of mud mixture and began applying it through her pipe system to the areas where the beetles were crossing. It slowed them down but didn't stop them. "There were simply too many," the transmitter crackled. "Lieutenant Crawford, this is Captain Nelson. We've analyzed your data and developed a plan. We're synthesizing the sulfur compound you described, and we'll use it to create a safe landing zone. But we need 20 minutes to prepare. Can you hold that long?" Abigail looked at the advancing beetles. They had already crossed the moat in 2 places and were approaching her shelter. "I'll try, Captain. Please hurry." She had one last defense prepared for this situation. During her weeks of captivity, Abigail had created a special mixture with an even higher concentration of the sulfur compound. It was so strong that she had to wear protective gloves when handling it. Now she loaded this mixture into her makeshift sprayer, a device she had built from her shower head and air compression tools. It wouldn't kill all the beetles, but it might buy her some time. The first beetles reached her door, their mandibles beginning to cut through the metal. Abigail put on her protective mask and gloves. When the door began to give way, she activated her sprayer. A fine mist of super-concentrated mud mixture filled the air around the entrance. The beetles caught in the spray immediately fell back, their shells smoking. But more kept coming. Abigail retreated to the center of her shelter. The beetles were now cutting through the walls in multiple places. She kept spraying, moving from one breach to another, but her mixture was running out. "Captain Nelson," she called into her transmitter. "They're inside my shelter. I need immediate extraction. Hold on, Lieutenant. We're on our way down. Look for our signal flare." A moment later, Abigail heard a loud whistling sound, and through a hole in her roof, she saw a bright red flare arcing across the sky. It landed about 100 yards away near the mud pools. The northern light was coming, but the beetles were already inside her shelter. One cut through a pipe near Abigail's head, barely missing her. Another began cutting through the floor beneath her feet. With her sprayer empty, Abigail grabbed her field shovel, the only weapon she had left. When a beetle lunged at her, she swung the shovel hard, knocking it back. But there were dozens more right behind it. A deafening roar filled the air as the Northern Lights landing engines fired. The sound was so powerful that the beetles paused momentarily, their clicking communication disrupted by the noise. Abigail used this moment to make a run for the door. Beetles covered the floor, walls, and ceiling of her shelter. She had to step on them, feeling their hard shells crack under her boots as she pushed through to the exit. Outside was chaos. The beetles were everywhere, but they were disoriented by the landing ship. The Northern Light was touching down near the mud pools, its engines blasting hot air across the landscape. Abigail ran toward the ship, dodging beetles as she went. Her mud moat was completely overrun now, covered with the bodies of dead beetles that formed bridges for the living ones to cross. "Lieutenant, over here!" a voice called. Through the swirling dust, Abigail saw a group of figures in protective suits, standing at the edge of the landing zone. They were spraying something around them, a liquid that kept the beetles at bay. It was the rescue team from the Northern Light, and they had recreated her sulfur formula. Abigail ran toward them, her lungs burning and her legs weak from exhaustion and hunger. She was only 20 yards from the team when she tripped over a beetle and fell hard onto the ground. Instantly, the beetles nearby converged on her. She felt sharp pain as one of them cut into her leg. Another was approaching her face, its mandibles open, then a spray of liquid covered her, and the beetles retreated. Strong hands grabbed her arms and pulled her up. She was being dragged toward the ship by 2 crew members in protective suits. "We've got you, Lieutenant. Just a few more steps." Abigail's vision was blurring, but she forced herself to keep moving. They reached the ship's ramp, which was covered in the sulfur liquid. The beetles wouldn't follow them here. Inside the ship, the ramp closed behind them. Abigail collapsed onto the floor of the airlock as the crew members removed their protective helmets. A woman with short gray hair knelt beside her. "Lieutenant Crawford, I'm Captain Olivia Nelson. You're safe now." Medical personnel rushed in, treating the cut on Abigail's leg and checking her for other injuries. They gave her water and emergency rations, which she consumed gratefully. As her strength returned, Abigail asked, "How did you find me?" "Did you receive my transmissions?" Captain Nelson nodded. "We picked up your first signal 3 days ago. We've been searching for survivors since we lost contact with the main camp. You're the only one we've found alive." The reality of those words hit Abigail hard. She was the sole survivor of the mission to Nexus 7. "The beetles," she said urgently. "We need to document everything about them. My research data is still in the shelter." "Already taken care of," Nelson replied. "We sent drones to retrieve your equipment and samples before we landed. Your mud formula is remarkable, Lieutenant. It saved your life and it saved our rescue team. Our science officer believes it could be the key to managing these creatures long-term." The ship's engines roared as they prepared for takeoff. Through a small window, Abigail could see her shelter, now completely covered with beetles. Her mud moat was gone, but it had protected her long enough. As the Northern Light lifted off, Captain Nelson sat beside Abigail. "Your survival is being called a miracle back on Earth, 45 days alone, surrounded by those things. How did you do it?" Abigail looked at the planet growing smaller below them. "I'm a soil scientist," she said simply. "I paid attention to what the land was telling." May. 3 months later, Abigail stood before the Earth Science Division Command, presenting her final report on the Nexus 7 mission. Her leg had healed, and she had regained most of the weight she had lost, though the nightmares of clicking sounds still haunted her sleep. "Based on my observations," she concluded, "the razor beetles are not merely predators. They're intelligent, adaptable, and organized. But they can be managed using the sulfur compounds I documented. I believe Nexus 7 can be safely recolonized. If proper defenses are established," the commander nodded. "Your recommendation has been accepted, Lieutenant Crawford. A new outpost will be established, using your mud moat design as the primary defense system. And you've been promoted to mission commander for the return expedition." Abigail was surprised. "You want me to go back?" "No one understands these creatures better than you. The Viridians have specifically requested your leadership. They're calling your mud moat design the Crawford method. It's becoming standard procedure on several insect-heavy worlds." Abigail thought about it for a moment. The idea of returning to Nexus 7 should have terrified her. But instead, she felt a strange sense of purpose. She had faced the worst that planet could offer, and she had survived. "I'll do it," she said. "But I want to bring Specialist Ben Garcia as my second-in-command. He's been helping me develop enhanced versions of the mud formula." The commander smiled. "Approved. The new mission launches in 6 months. This time, Lieutenant, we'll be ready for whatever that planet throws at us." As Abigail left the meeting, she thought about how a simple mud moat had saved her life. Sometimes the oldest, simplest solutions were still the best. Earth's first colonists had used moats to protect their castles from invaders. Now, thousands of years later and light years from home, she had used the same concept to survive on an alien world. Human ingenuity, she reflected, would always find a way to adapt and survive, even when facing the most alien of threats.